Welcome to the fourth Behavioral, Social, and Sciences Summit. And this is the second one co-branded with the Social Science Research Council, of which Ira Katz-Nelson is the president. The impetus for this summit came from the Future of Scholarly Knowledge project, which is run by Ken Pruitt, who coincidentally is our SAGE CASBS prize winner this year. It was funded by SAGE Publications, which is run by Sarah Miller-McCune, sitting up here, who is also, I want you to clap now, because she also provided the name for the directorship of CASBS, which I now proudly hold. So I have two names, Margaret Levi and Sarah Miller-McCune. So both SSRC and CASBS are participants in this process of rethinking about the production, dissemination, and transformation of knowledge in the 21st century. And both CASBS and SSRC have had important series of discussions leading up to this, and will have a series of meetings and discussions following this, including another major meeting in New York, which SSRC will host. But now let me turn for a moment to CASBS itself, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. I'm not going to take my few minutes here telling you all I'd like to tell you, but feel free to ask me in the corridors or during breaks, and you just press a button and my spiel comes out, and I'll be glad to give it to you. But the bottom line is that we're a prestigious academic year fellowship program that's existed for 60 plus years. We host about 40 fellows a year who are extraordinary thinkers and scholars who come to our beautiful campus, which is across Uniparacera near the golf course. We have a series of programs, you can check your brochure, that help fulfill our 60-plus year mission of ensuring that the best research in social sciences and cognate disciplines are used in the service of ensuring better societies and better thinking about societies. Just to name three recent initiatives where you can find us and our scholars participating. The Future of Work and Workers series, which appears daily during the week in Pacific Standard Magazine, psmag.com/work. We have a series of collaborations with Long Now at their interval bar and space. So keep an eye out for when there will be events there. We had one this week, which was spectacular. And we have an ongoing and new collaboration with Parleo.com, and I'll just let you look them up. Wael Gonim, who is one of the founders of Parleo.com, will be here later today, and you might check things out with him. Before turning to our first keynote speaker, let me also thank our sponsors who helped to make this day possible. SAGE Publications, Hewlett Foundation, Luce Foundation, the Dean of the Research School at Stanford, and I also want to thank our media partner, which won't surprise you, is Pacific Standard Magazine. Now let me turn to Tim O'Reilly, who we're very lucky to have here today. I feel a little foolish even attempting an intro, given how well-known Tim O'Reilly already is. But let me elaborate a little on the bio that you can find in your program. I'm not going to repeat the bio. You can read that. We have a literate group here. But let me say a few additional things. Tim was famously dubbed the Oracle of Silicon Valley by Inc. magazine in 2010 for his ability to see around corners regarding almost every important technology development. He's, quote, the guy who will tell you what smart people will be talking about 5 years from now. In 2012, Wired magazine noted that his ability to quickly identify nascent trends is unparalleled. As an interesting side note, this famous tech guy graduated cum laude with a degree in classics at Harvard, from Harvard. There is considerable overlap between Tim's interest and those of CASBS and SSRC. Tim uses his platform, which is considerably, I think you have 2 million Twitter followers, something like that, to address broad societal concerns and then to advocate for solutions. A recurring mantra of his is that entrepreneurs and companies should create more value than they capture, engage in creative destruction and innovation with a true sense of mission in order to help make the world a better place. That's from the Huffington Post. His current mission, current interest, is similar to that of the CASBS Future of Work and Workers project. How, as a result of a lot of disruption, the very nature of work can change. In the next economy, what will we dignify as work? What will we derive satisfaction from? I am delighted that Tim is participating in our summit this week, and I look forward to joining his conference next week on the WTF economy. WTF stands for What's the Future? But you've already gotten the intentional double meaning. And WTF in knowledge is what concerns us today. Tim?
Thank you very much.
Sure.
First off, in response to that introduction, I should say my reputation exceeds me. So don't get your hopes up too high. Since the theme of today's meeting is knowledge, I thought I would talk about knowledge in the age of Siri, Uber, and HoloLens, with a subtitle of "We've got this whole unicorn thing wrong," because I think the real unicorn is not what people in Silicon Valley think it is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I want to start with a conversation I had 4 or 5 years ago. It was a dinner with Reid Hoffman and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island. And in the course of the dinner, I made the comment that we needed a Moore's Law for healthcare. And Senator Whitehouse said, "What's Moore's Law?" And I won't comment on that. But I will comment on Reid's response, which I thought was perfect. He said, "You must understand, Senator, that in Washington you think that every year things are going to cost more and do less. Whereas in Silicon Valley, we understand that every year our products have to do more and cost less." I meant the other way around. In Washington, cost more and do less, yes. Cost less and do more. So basically, that sums up an immense promise that we've seen come from Silicon Valley. And this doubling of computing power was a big part of what helped us put the man on the moon, but it also then made it such that a watch today has more computing than the man on the moon. But I got that wrong. That's an Apple Watch. I should be showing a cheap watch, right? Because really, this computing power is everywhere. But it's also led to a vast expansion of demand for computing. There's a famous statement attributed to Thomas Watson, where in 1945 he said, "I see no need for more than 5 computers in the world." Of course, by the time this picture came out, when he was introducing the System 360 about 15 years later, he'd obviously changed his tune. But worth thinking about there. Moore's Law is responsible for a cascade of miracles. It's given us great powers, and the real question we have to ask ourselves: are we using them wisely? And so I wrote a piece on Medium a few weeks ago called "We've Got This Whole Unicorn Thing Wrong." You guys may have heard this Silicon Valley term, unicorn. A unicorn is a startup with a valuation of at least $1 billion. I think that's actually not a very good definition, right? There's this list of the 149 Silicon Valley startups that are currently valued over $1 billion. Some of them are bubble valuations, but that's not why it's wrong. It's wrong because a unicorn is something marvelous. I love this quote from Tom Stoppard where he talks about somebody seeing a unicorn for the first time and it's truly amazing. And it's when the second person sees it that it becomes the most amazing, because then it's starting to become real. And then after that, it becomes progressively less amazing until eventually, as Stoppard says, it becomes as thin as reality. So, a unicorn is something that makes us say, WTF, this is amazing. What's going on here? And so here's a unicorn for you. Can you imagine the first time a woman made a fire at home? I like to think it was a woman, not a man, who basically said, "We can domesticate this stuff. This is amazing. We can cook food, you know, and, you know, changed society tremendously. Here's some more unicorns. You know, the wheel, stone tools, the plow. That, by the way, is Thomas Jefferson's mold board of least resistance, which I kind of like. He was still working on the plow, and he actually put that into the public domain, which is a good reminder of another thing about unicorns is they actually have to create value for society. Of course, here's another fabulous unicorn. Some of you who've been in Washington will recognize this is the War Department Library at the old Executive Office Building. You know, the book, Capturing Knowledge, amazing world-transforming unicorn. And so all these things are now taken completely for granted. But, you know, we still have things that are sort of on the cusp. And I was reminded of this recently when I was on a bus. And I pulled out my phone to figure out where I should get off. And an old man sitting next to me said, "What are you doing?" Because he looked over my shoulder, and I said, "See that little blue dot? It follows along where we are, and it shows me where we are on the route, and I know where I want to get off." And he was just bug-eyed. And then the old man on the other side got all excited and pulled out his phone, and I got off, and he was, you know, watched the two of them as they were showing to each other. You know, this was once marvelous. 10 years ago, can you even go back to that memory of, you know, first having Google Maps on your phone and watching the blue dot follow you around? You know, particularly when you're walking, it was, you know, really remarkable. You're kind of getting these directions, you know, and of course it's now as thin as reality. And so there's sort of this infrastructure of unicorns. You know, when the U.S. government put up the first GPS satellites, it was originally, you know, a military thing, and they made a policy decision, super important, to put it into civilian, to open it up for civilian use. And you think about all of the cascading things that have happened from that, you know, navigation systems, but then the next layer up of services like the on-demand economy, which are sort of second-order effects of this sort of government program. I'm bringing that up just to remind you that government does do some innovation here. But it also tells us something about the continual cascading evolution of knowledge. We build on knowledge. We build on what we learn from each other, and each step takes us further. And so, anyway, so this to the unicorn point, what makes a real unicorn? It is amazing. It changes the way the world works, and it changes the way that we actually are as people. And then finally, it has enormous impact, and it has much bigger impact than on just the venture capitalists and the entrepreneurs. And so we have to think bigger. So there's a great quote from Michael Schrage, who wrote a book a few years ago called "Who Do You Want Your Customers to Become?" And in it, he talks about how really great innovations actually change their customers. You know, when Henry Ford, introduced the assembly line, he didn't just change the way that manufacturing happened with the assembly line. He actually changed our entire society. You know, and there were a lot of things very intentionally that he did. You know, he said, "Oh, I have to pay my workers more so that they can afford to buy my product. Oh, I have to give them time off so they can use my product." Invented the weekend so that people would take drives in the country. You know, you start thinking about all the cascading changes that came. People changed as a result of that. And you see that today, you know, with smartphones, for example. And, there's an ask that Schrage is referring to when Apple introduced Siri. They're asking us to think very, very differently about our devices. It's this smart thing that we can talk to and that talks back. That's kind of astonishing, you know. And in fact, if you look at these unicorn technologies of today, our kids are growing up in a very, very different world, and they think very differently as a result. So those are things that, you know, will help you to identify a true unicorn. You know, it's amazing when you first see it. It becomes part of the stuff of reality as time goes on, and it changes the people who use it. So I want to just kind of highlight a few features of some 21st century unicorns that are slowly starting to fade into the ordinary. First off, the World Wide Web. You know, I'm putting up here, you know, the web page. Just imagine, you know, some of us remember the coming of the World Wide Web. And, I was one of the early advocates. There were only a couple hundred websites when I first sort of started pushing it. And we were showing it at a conference in 1993. And I still remember people just being amazed. They didn't believe it. And we've forgotten that now. We take it for granted, but it was truly amazing. People had seen CD-ROM-based, hypertext, but when you first clicked on something, you said, that just brought a document from Hawaii. They would say, no, that didn't happen. They just, the internet was not really that widespread yet, and it seemed utterly astonishing. And now, of course, it's the fabric of reality. It changes to people who believe that we should be able to find anything, anytime. We can ask Google virtually any question and hope to get a reasonable answer. Think about YouTube, this amazing thing where people are uploading videos. There's countless how-to videos. There's so many things. Like I chose this particular example because some years ago I was in Sicily and had this amazing fish baked in salt. And I went, how do I make that? And sure enough, there's a recipe on YouTube, a little 5-minute video. I made it successfully at home, and I've made it many times since. That amazing new access to knowledge. Wikipedia, again, one of those destination sites. But, you think about how something happens. This is an old slide that I've used because it's so remarkable. You think about that earthquake in Japan in 2012. This is the first Wikipedia entry. There's revision history, so you can kind of go back and see that first entry. It was just like an earthquake occurred. And then you can kind of watch, you can actually animate Wikipedia entries, and you can watch how it evolved as thousands of people contributed to update that entry. Together, sort of, I think it was probably 5,000 or 6,000 people actually contributed to it until it eventually became this full-featured encyclopedia entry. So it's basically this amazing affordance for people to collaborate in knowledge creation, as well as this amazing tool for people to find out about things. But so this notion that the knowledge sharing systems are real-time is super important because when you look at something like Twitter, a few days ago, I don't really follow the World Series. I discovered that it was happening because it was on Twitter. But let's leave that aside. I saw my friends enjoying it. I understood that it was going into extra innings. This was, just sort of ambient awareness. Now, sure, you had some of that from the radio, but here is sort of like this shared consciousness channel. And, when something important happens, it flashes around the world immediately. When something like an earthquake happens, it is typically reported on Twitter before it's reported in any other media. And that, in some sense, is a kind of real-time collective consciousness. And this sort of real-time collective consciousness really shows up now increasingly in real-time mapping. This is a series of slides, from my commute from Oakland into San Francisco, going to Code for America in the morning. And some days it says, oh, there's bad traffic, there's an alternate route. When traffic is in a different pattern, it'll say, no, you got to just suffer. And so on. There's various kind of options that it gives me because it has real-time knowledge of traffic. My wife actually had an even more remarkable experience in Texas when she was visiting her grandparents. They just moved, and she's getting on the freeway, and it says, get off in 7 miles, and then suddenly it says, get off at the next exit. And she's like, it told me 7 miles, and now it's saying the next exit. She gets off the next exit, sees a whole train of cars, and as she's going down the exit ramp, she sees there's an accident up ahead. So this is, a result of a system called Waze, which Google acquired, which really is bringing real-time traffic into these navigation systems. And so again, there's this consciousness, this knowledge that is actually becoming accessible to all of us, that is created by all of us. It's often implicit knowledge. We're not even thinking we're contributing, but our car is driving along. The GPS, that's the other side of that blue dot, being reported back up, millions of times, and Google inferring the patterns, and then increasingly going, okay, there's something happening right now. So, in some ways you can say we are building a global brain, and we're part of it. That's actually a network routing map of the internet. It looks actually remarkably like pictures of synapses in the brain. And we're increasingly adding more and more sensors, things like GPS, but also cameras. There's really interesting stories of people actually being able to research the effect of global warming by looking at online photos in Flickr and the dates of them and going, okay, spring is getting earlier. Amazing kinds of things you can do with this collection of statistical knowledge. There's also this great quote from Danny Hillis, who once, actually this was relayed to me by Jeff Bezos, who'd heard it from him, where Danny said, global consciousness is that thing responsible for deciding that pots containing decaffeinated coffee should be orange. Think about it. Somehow that became, it was actually, I think, originally Sanka's brand color, but it became a standard in large parts of the world. And you think about how memes spread. And that's always been the case. I mean, they've spread through, books, through, print media, they've spread through television and radio. But the speed with which memes spread is very, very different. You'll see memes kind of flash up and go away. Like Occupy Wall Street. I remember when that happened. It sort of all of a sudden it was everywhere. Then it went away. Hashtags on Twitter are kind of like a small version of this. And there's sort of an interesting point here. People have been thinking about this from the very earliest days of computing. In his wonderful book about John von Neumann, called Turing's Cathedral, George Dyson quotes von Neumann as saying the message system used in the nervous system is of an essentially statistical character. And he goes on to really talk about the notion of frequency pulse coding as an alternate way of thinking about computing. And it really comes out in a lot of ways. These guys were starting to think about what eventually became PageRank, the Google system for noticing which sites are most often linked to. And the way that, just as in the brain, we're starting to say some things are more important than others because we see them again and again and again. And we see them in different contexts. And we're starting to build a very different kind of knowledge machine as a result of having all this stuff online, all this stuff connected, and being able to do statistical inference against it. But we're also making explicit choices increasingly. Sites like Kickstarter. I just went up there the other day when I'm doing the slides for this and saw somebody's trying to fund a documentary on Maya Angelou. And you go, so the sort of crowdfunding is a way of reaching out to millions of people and saying, hey, should we do this thing? Should we create this knowledge artifact? So it's starting to become intentional. In his early science fiction book, Down Out in the Magic Kingdom, Cory Doctorow describes what he calls the adhocracy, which is a civilization that's really built on the kind of principles of Kickstarter. It's a civilization of abundance where nanotechnology is taking care of our material wants. And instead, people are competing for a currency of attention. Does that sound at all familiar with what's happening already on social media? I think it's a very prescient book. And we really have to start thinking about what does that world look like in which attention is, in fact, a major currency. But the thing I really want to talk about for the rest of this talk is the next big wave. Because all of the things I've been talking about so far, well, most of the things I've been talking about so far, are really sort of in the realm of knowledge products. That we think about media and the creation of media. But increasingly, the principles of the internet are hitting the real world. We saw that a little bit with the discussion of Google Maps and real-time traffic. But Jeff Immelt, when he started talking of GE, when he started talking about the industrial internet, really raised this issue of, okay, let's actually start getting our big machines, our meaningful parts of our infrastructure connected to this thing. And it made me ask, how does our society start changing when our factories and our infrastructure starts being connected? And I think that's a major issue coming forward. And that's why I launched this event that Margaret referred to. It's actually called the Next Economy Summit, because I think we have to get from the WTF economy. Because WTF is an expression of wonder, but it's also an expression of disgust or dismay. There's a lot that's wonderful and a lot that's awful. We have to figure out how to make it the next economy. Just have these things stop, be unicorns, and be basically the new rules of our society. But I think that we're going to have a major business transformation because the rules that have already upended the media industry are starting to upend other industries. And I want to talk about some of the issues that raises. So let's start with self-driving cars. What do they teach us? This is the new version of the Google self-driving car. So the first thing that they teach us is sort of unexpected. Because if you think back when the first self-driving car competition, the DARPA Grand Challenge in 2005, happened. The winning entry went 7 miles in 7 hours. And then it was sort of, 4 years later, or 4 years later, Google sort of first showed off their car. Then they said, hey, it's driven, hundreds of thousands of miles in ordinary traffic. What happened? Peter Norvig of Google said, we don't have better algorithms than anybody else. We just have more data. And it turned out that a lot of that data came from Google Street View. They had cars out there mapping every road with very precisely, measuring everything, and as Peter said to me, trying to decide whether a stoplight is red or green when you already know it's there is a heck of a lot easier than trying to identify it in a sort of moving image in the first place. So basically by doing this pre-mapping, they were able to actually get a lot more data into the algorithm. And the thing that's sort of really, really interesting there, of course, is that data came from humans, right? So some driver you could think of as an augmented human equipped with amazing sensors was driving around on all those roads, measuring everything incredibly precisely as input to the global brain, which it then can remember and replay. And that's kind of a design pattern, and it's the same design pattern that you see in something like Waze with the real-time traffic. It's taking input from humans, collecting it into an aggregate work, and then being able to replay it through a machine. And Tesla's now in the same game, but you've probably been hearing about the Tesla autopilot, and it's basically they've kind of slipstreamed this into society already, just simply by making it a feature of an existing vehicle, and it's going to be kind of interesting to see how that plays out over time. But anyway, the net is this global brain. It's us connected and augmented, but it's not just about media anymore. It's actually starting to be about real-world services. And, back in the early days of computing, J.C.R. Licklider called this, I will update his language and call it human-computer symbiosis, but the original paper was called man-computer symbiosis. But he said the hope that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought, and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. And I think this is a fundamental insight into how we should be thinking about topics like artificial intelligence. Because we have this illusion that somehow artificial intelligence is other than us. Whereas in fact it may be all of us. I wrote a little piece for John Brockman in his book, How Do We Think About Machines That Think, in which I suggested that perhaps we are the microbiome of the global AI that is just now being born. In some sense, we are part of it, but not necessarily a meaningful thinking part of it. We're just an aggregate part of it, and part of its extended life system. And we may be looking in the wrong place. But anyway, so back to this sort of notion of unicorns and thinking about what do we actually learn and about from the unicorns that we can apply to the kinds of products that we build. And so the first lesson is that increasingly knowledge is being integrated into real-world situations and processes. It's no longer something that you put into an artifact that somebody then consumes and acts on. It often is acted on directly. I like to say, this Google self-driving car used to be a book. You kind of would produce an artifact that had the information, the person would consume it and act on it, and now the device can act on it without actually the human even bothering to consume. And there's an intermediate step that I think a lot of us in the knowledge business are concerned with. Well, we're going to take that digital knowledge and we're going to put it into a digital artifact, and that may be great. You think about Google Maps on the phone, you consume it, in the same way you would consume a paper map, but it's infinitely scalable. It has everything. It has additional layers, like you can actually get directions from one point to another generated automatically. You don't have to send it off to AAA to get a triptych. You make it on the fly. There's all these neat features, but ultimately, if you look at the arc of data, it is towards it disappearing into products and services. And so, if you think about that, with something like Uber, you're actually saying, okay, this used to be a map and directions, and now it's effectively a service. And how many people here have not ever taken a Lyft or an Uber? Okay, a few people. You should try it. But, and you think about this, it really is an information product. When you use it, first of all, there's that information that makes it possible for the driver to find you, for the driver to find your destination. But there's also tracking. If you ever get the receipt that Uber shows, it shows the route that you took. And if you don't think after the fact that it was the right route or the best route, you can complain. They tell you how long it took, exactly where you went, and lets you rate the driver. So there's sort of the whole collective intelligence aspect there. So there's a lot of different information elements there. And of course, you don't have to pay because your information is already embedded in the application, your payment information. So you just get in, get out. You're done. So knowledge embedded into applications and devices. Next step, I think the agents like Siri and Google Now are really game-changing. When you can talk to a device, it absolutely changes the game. And I think if these things are getting better and better. I think it will be the norm for next generation just to talk to the device. And it also means that you can you can give instructions in some sense to the computer. I had a really good example recently where I said, okay, Google, now remind me to get currants next time I'm at Whole Foods. That's all I have to say. And Google says, okay, I know what Whole Foods is. I know where Whole Foods is. And next time I was at Whole Foods, up popped an alert on my phone saying, remember to get currants. So think about that. That's a totally different approach to thinking about knowledge products, and it requires, of course, a whole infrastructure. There's an infrastructure of unicorns there that is part of the fabric of our coming society. Parking, same thing. You can kind of have Google remember where you left your car. So they're magical experiences, unicorn experiences. They bring knowledge right to the point where you need it. And that really is the key question to me with knowledge. How do we use the capabilities of our devices to build better human experiences? And there was a great quote from Aaron Levy, the founder of Box, where he said Uber is a $3.5 billion, I think it's now, $60-some billion lesson in building for how the world should work instead of optimizing for how the world does work. There's a real opportunity to use these tools to reinvent how we do things, not just to do sort of a warmed-over digital version of something from the analog world. So, second lesson, I've already talked about this. These are systems made up of computers and humans working together. But when I was talking about it earlier, I was talking about it on a statistical basis. But realistically, when you think about a service like Uber or Lyft, this is a system, an application, that literally has humans as part of the application. I mean, they are literally inside that application system. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what does this mean about how we organize work, how we organize people? I wrote another piece called Networks and the Nature of the Firm, making the argument that as we start to think about the implications of computer programs bringing workers on demand as requested by users in real time, the whole nature of how we organize the workers, of course, changes. That's this whole question that people are wrestling with around on-demand economy. Back in 2008, I gave a talk at Fidelity, and one of the executives said, we know about all these new technologies. What we don't know is how to organize ourselves to use them effectively. And I think that question of how we organize ourselves in this new world is going to be fairly critical. Obviously, factory work completely changed human organization, and I think this new world is changing human organization as well. And whether it's things like open source with programs like GitHub, or whether it's Airbnb or Uber, or even the Apple Store, these are different ways of using technology to organize people in the real world. Think about it. We spent a long time using technology to take people out of retail. And Apple became the most successful retailer in the world by using technology to put people back into the store, to figure out how to use them more effectively to create a better user experience for customers. So all these things are new ways of organizing people. The next lesson I would say is that you want to use knowledge to give people superpowers. Our phones used to appear as the tools of superheroes. Here's Dick Tracy with his, amazing, wristwatch, and, Captain Kirk with his communicator. Of course, we all have that today. And so there's that wonderful sense that any application that matters should appear to people of the past as a kind of superpower. But it's also important to realize, because of that idea that these things have people inside them, that we're also empowering workers with superpowers. And I think there's a really great example in the case of something like Uber, Lyft, or any of these on-demand driving applications. Because knowing your way around is a real skill. You guys have probably, if you haven't read this wonderful New York Times piece from last year on the knowledge, which is the test that they give London black cabbies. It's just an astonishing thing. Actually, I have my cousin's husband, actually, after he retired, took the knowledge or mastered the knowledge. And it's just like astonishing what they have to learn. And, but now you can take virtually anybody off the street, and they can, sure, they're not good enough to pass the knowledge, even with, Google Maps and Waze. There's this mention in here of, one of the questions is, there's a small statue, and it turns out it's on the facade of a building, and you have to know where it is, And, there's just like 25,000 streets. They have to be able to recite them off by name. They have to actually be able to recite turn-by-turn directions from any point to any other point in London. They've got to know every building. It's just crazy how much they have to learn. But functionally, you can augment a worker with a smartphone app so they can do a good part of that job. And that notion of augmenting people so that they can do things that they couldn't do before actually becomes game-changing. Uber and Lyft have 3 or 4 or 5 times as many cars on the streets as there were taxis before, making rides more and more available because they can augment workers to do things that previously required specialization. So, the Uber or Lyft driver is an augmented worker. And increasingly so is the Watson-enabled doctor. That's really where I think we'll see more and more AI coming into play as an augmentation for humans. And this is basically one of Microsoft's ads for HoloLens. They're really focused on augmented reality and productivity, which is, again, I think super, super interesting. But I think the thing I want to just put on the table is, in this experience economy of the future, we actually have to have great experiences for workers, not just for consumers. And that's another piece that I wrote called Workers in a World of Continuous Partial Employment, and kind of mocked up an image there contrasting Lyft with Walmart. Because it turns out a lot of people are very critical of the on-demand economy, saying, well, these are not good jobs, they don't have any other protections or benefits, et cetera, et cetera. These people should be employees, and as if that would solve everything. Because when you dig in and you think, well, what is actually the alternative? It's, yes, you are a W-2 worker and you have a few, not very useful protections. But it turns out that your schedule is managed algorithmically by a program that makes sure that you don't get more than 29 hours a week, so you don't have to be paid health benefits. That schedules you for the convenience of the employer, not for your own convenience. And it's a pretty grim life, right? And there's a lot that we have to really tackle there, because the old model doesn't work. And yes, on the other side, you have a marketplace algorithm that says, we need workers, we'll pay you more if you show up now, because we need more of you right now. And you go, actually, that's actually a better way to marshal people with computing than tightly scheduling them and monitoring them and making sure that they do exactly what you say. And so I think there's a big challenge of figuring out on this front of how do we organize people using information, using algorithms. There's a lot to work out. But at the same time, there's a lot of pain coming. This is a recent article in the Atlantic called In Praise of Short-Term Thinking, which really made the point that, yes, looking at the long arc of history, you see that in past revolutions, the Industrial Revolution and so on, there's been displacement, but in the long run, everyone became wealthier. It says, but you got to actually pay attention to the short term as well, because there are people who are going to be displaced, who are going to be hurting, and we can't ignore that. A lot of people who are focused on these changes are focused on things like business disruption. IBM just put out this report, basically talking about the Uber effect. A competitor coming out of nowhere, with a completely different business model. It used to be called the Amazon effect, but this is going to affect everybody in trucking, in delivery of all kinds, in logistics, and so they're thinking about it from that business perspective. I was part of the Markle Rework America initiative, looking at the impact of all these technologies on jobs and how do we preserve kind of middle-class jobs. A lot of good thinking there. Roosevelt Institute, really interesting report recently called Rewriting the Rules, about some of the fundamental rules that shape our market economy that we take for granted as if they're laws of nature, when in fact they're things that we've basically built into the system that favor some people rather than others. But my own, policy recommendation is that we have to stop thinking about jobs. We have to start thinking about work, because in the end, it's what we are trying to do that creates jobs. And I have this quote that I've used the last 6-7 years. It's actually a bastardized sort of abridgment of a Rilke poem called "The Man Watching." And it's basically about Jacob wrestling with the angel, and that's a wonderful Delacroix painting of that subject. And it basically says, what we fight with is so small, and when we win, it makes us small. This is how we grow, by being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. And I love that sentiment, because we have to try things that are hard. And when all we care about is sort of preserving, what we had, rather than tackling big problems, we're in trouble. I just read a great article this morning it was on Medium, a woman comparing Amazon and the federal government, talking about how, look, Amazon is running a deficit. They're continually pulling in capital, running a deficit so they can grow, deliver new services. Why aren't we doing hard things that need doing and putting our money towards that? And so anyway, my challenge to Silicon Valley is to think bigger. I see things like, we're the Uber of dry cleaning, and a little part of me dies. I want to see things like, okay, what's the Uber for healthcare? We have an opportunity to completely, reinvent an industry that affects all of us. That's going to, in fact, become more and more important as our population ages, and so on. So, I look at some of the grand challenges we face, whether it's infrastructure or the whole demographic inversion, income inequality, climate change, displaced peoples, and you go, there is an enormous amount to do. And so, I've been kind of trying to get people to think about something that Nick Hanauer, who's one of the speakers at my event, says. He says, technology is the solution to human problems. We won't run out of work till we run out of problems. So we have to take all this marvelous technology and put it to work on the right stuff. And that is our biggest policy challenge. I don't think we should be sitting there saying, oh, let's sort of try to figure out how to preserve good middle-class jobs. We should be saying, what needs doing that's hard, that we couldn't do before, that we can do now? And bring out all of our best ingenuity and our best thinking to solve those problems. And then I guarantee you there will be plenty of work to go around. So my ending injunction is to work on stuff that matters. So, thank you. So I think we have a little time for Q&A. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm game to talk about anything you guys want to talk about. All right. Do we need a mic, or are we just going
to... Tim, that was a great presentation, but I want to push back a little bit against it. And against, it seems to me that you talk about technology, you talk about markets, and you talk about governments all looking for solutions for the major problems that face us. What seems to me to be missing here, and from a lot of what I hear from Silicon Valley, is talk about politics. And here, if you think, for example, so you mentioned Corey's great book, which talks about adhocracy. His new book, which is coming out next year, is all about how adhocracy doesn't work and how effectively you need political struggle to get things done.
Yeah.
And so one of my questions is, so when you, for example, you talk about the ways in which the alternatives of Uber and Walmart, so that maybe Walmart is not that great because they have these algorithms which are designed basically to game the regulations. Uber, obviously there's a big fight going on at the moment in California. All of these are questions where you see a big imbalance in the power of some actors vis-a-vis other actors, so whether it be Walmart, whether it be Uber. From one perspective, these are two different aspects of the same kind of problem. So how do you get back power? How do you get questions of power, questions of politics into the discourse of Silicon Valley, which I think has done some wonderful things for how we think about government, but I think is less strong in thinking about situations where there isn't an obvious engineering solution and where, in fact, there's real political contention about which solution is the appropriate solution to work.
Well,
and here unions, I think, is the final word I'd like to bring in here.
Yeah, I actually have quite a few union people at my event, and I'm probably too many for Silicon Valley's taste. But I guess I would say, first off, when you say if there were real contention about policy issues, that's part of the problem, at least here in America. There is not real contention about policy issues. Nobody's talking about real issues. We have a sort of a sham politics, which is why so many people are opting out. And I do think, and my own personal focus there, working, Jen Palka, who'll be here later, my wife started a nonprofit called Code for America, which is really focused on how government actually works. We actually have a lot of policies that do really good things, but they don't work. Not because the policy is wrong, but because the implementation is so bad. And I think the first thing that we have to do is we have to actually start fixing government so that it actually delivers on its promises. So then people start trusting it again. And then we can have real discussions about whether we're doing the right thing or not. Because right now, it's all, what happens in Washington is all a sham. At the end of the day, people go on doing whatever they do. People work, again, taking that Walmart example, here's a policy that was instituted many, many years ago. The government has no capability to monitor, to understand. If you contrast that, I wrote a paper a few years back called Open Data and Algorithmic Regulation around the notion that regulation should be focused on outcomes, not on rules. You should change the rules all the time if you're not achieving the outcomes. And if you think about Google, for example, with search quality, or credit card companies with credit card fraud, there's a new attack. They come up with a new solution. They don't say, well, we wrote the rules in 1993. In the meantime, let them steal your money. We really have to actually get government to a point where it actually is able to act more like, in my opinion, more like Silicon Valley, so that it can actually implement the policies we already have. And then we can start getting back to debate about, is that the right policy, rather than just sort of finger pointing because we spent all the money and we didn't get anything for it. Which is, I think, what has become the focus of our politics is oh, well, government doesn't work, we're spending, drown it in the bathtub. Whereas, in fact, if it was doing what it was supposed to, we would probably have a much better discussion. Over here.
Game changer. I think if you would look at the evolution of power of energy, you would see a whole series of game changers, and one on the horizon is unlimited clean power from fusion. And I'd like to hear your comments about how that might be a game changer. One could actually make a scenario that suggests that that will not actually save the environment, but will actually destroy the environment, because it will allow technology to blossom everywhere and get rid of everything.
Yeah, well, first off, I think we're, I would love it to have that if we had that problem. I think we're still a ways off from, workable, fusion. So that's been receding for, decades, so that it's always off in the future. And again, there are, I still have hope that there will be some great energy breakthrough, but I think at the moment we have to work with the energy sources that we have. And again, I think it's great. There's also some interesting things in other forms of traditional, fission reactors that could be much more efficient and safer. But yes, we should explore all these things. But I'm not holding out hope for a magic bullet.
The real question was, is that a panacea or is that actually a curse?
I think every solution is a new problem. And we just have to get used to that, live with it. We there's always unintended consequences. Yeah. Somewhere over, I guess over on this side of the room, it's making trouble. You guys, whatever, you should just use a swarming algorithm. Whoever's the closest to get to, that way we'll get more time.
Just 2 or 3 things that you would do to change our educational system to create an educational system in this country that can act effectively on the new knowledge that's occurring?
Yeah, I think. You can actually judge by what I do. My stepdaughter goes to a maker school, where it's all project-based. I think we should have a lot more project-based education where if you think how much knowledge is now available on demand, the very best thing you can do is give kids challenging projects where they go, oh, I need to figure out how to do this, and summon the knowledge that they need. These kids are learning things, and they go, oh, wait, we need this math. They watch a Khan Academy video. They learn how to do the math they needed to calculate how to do the project. I think that's one of the first things I would do. I think that the inverted education model is a really good one, where the homework should be the lectures, not the work afterwards as you work together in class. I think, if you see what we do in universities typically, I remember going to Cambridge University and walking around the computer science lab, and it's the professor leaning over people's shoulder looking at their projects and giving them feedback and helping them. And, they get the lectures on video. It's like, it's sort of like a little backwards the way we do it in our schools. And then I think also I think my third policy recommendation would be we actually really, really need to make sure that we have consistent funding for every district. Right now you have so much better schooling in rich districts, and I think we really need to make sure that everybody gets the same level of funding.
Hi, I believe in human ingenuity to get through the problems of displacement that we may face in the short term. I wonder whether you have some examples for us when we get through that, of what the future of work may look like. So how people are able to participate in the economy. Yeah. Maybe the answer is next week at your conference.
Yeah. No. I actually probably. I have a running joke with Hal Varian. Hal Varian once said that if you want to understand the future, just look at what rich people do today. And it first seems like a very Silicon Valley statement and kind of offensive, but when you really think about it, it's sort of like, wow, used to be that rich people went on the Grand Tour, and now you look at soccer hooligans go on the Grand Tour. It used to be that rich people had satellite phones, and now everybody has a cell phone. Rich people used to have drivers. Now, wait, it's moving. It's certainly not all the way down to everybody. Although it's interesting, there was actually a college dean in Atlanta who became a Lyft driver just to understand it better, and he found that most of his fares were actually picking up people from poor neighborhoods that were underserved by public transportation and taking them to public transportation. So, there's some real truth to that. So anyway, my joke with Hal is that the future is the Downton Abbey economy. What do rich people do? They entertain their friends and they take care of people who are less fortunate. And we can see some signs of that. The social media economy is all about entertaining our friends, and the Kickstarter economy, is really about funding that. And I actually think that would be a pretty good future. And actually, Margaret referred to this in her introduction. One of the things that I've really thought about is we're going to have to start dignifying some of those things as work. Right now, if somebody's trying to write the great American novel and working as a waiter, we let them say, I'm a novelist. When somebody, works at their social media presence, we don't actually think that they're working. And I think in the future there may be things like that that will give people dignity because they go, I am working at it. And there are people, of course, who are doing that on YouTube. My favorite example is the wonderful social media presence of a guy named Brandon Stanton. You may know Humans of New York, which I think is I've called it the first true great work of art that's actually happened on the internet. It's just, again, if you're not familiar with it, go check it out. It's on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Tumblr. It's everywhere. But basically every day he goes out and he takes a picture and he interviews somebody on the streets. And his work is unbelievable, portrait of humanity today. And I think about that. He's making a living at it. But, that's an example of what the future of work could be. Do we have time for one more, or are we good? We should stop. We need to wrap. One more.
I wanted to follow up on the question about education. Imagine you had a lot of authority over one of the most prominent and well-resourced universities in the world. What kinds of decisions would you make for that institution?
Talking about Stanford, I have not really given that much thought, and I would probably be shooting from the hip. But I would say, I guess from my own experience, teaching people to do things is more important than teaching people to know things, and because if you're trying to do things, you will attract knowledge. And I think Stanford actually does a pretty good job of that. But I'm not sure other places do. This actually, if you want to understand the wonderful, my advice would be go read, Surely You Must Be Joking, Mr. Feynman, and read the section where he talks about his visit to Brazil and when they asked him to evaluate their physics program. And it was just like he just totally ripped them a new one because they were just teaching them book knowledge. And they couldn't actually do anything as a result of what they learned. And I think that focus on understanding why we learn. And there is a whole side of academics. I still think back. I was in classics, and I think when one of my friends sent me his paper on images of bees in Homer, and I thought, this is utterly useless, and it's utterly delightful, because there's a kind of learning which is also a kind of play. And I guess I would say, as well as learning how to use knowledge for work, we need to remember how to use knowledge for play. Thank you.